Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing the Eureka Masters of Cinema Blu-ray release of a new 4K restoration of the 1963 film The Cruel Tale of Bushido, which is often labeled as just a samurai film or a historical film, or at least that's the sort of film you're led to expect when you read about it or hear it mentioned, but it is really something that steps far outside of any typical sort of genre classification and is extraordinarily unique. It was directed by Tadashi Imai, known for his films of social realism, and stars Kinnosuke Nakamura, who gives, I think, one of the most stunning multi-performances in all of cinema. Typically when this film is discussed, the first thing you hear about is the similarities to Kind Hearts and Coronets, where Alec Guinness famously played many members of the same family. Well, here in this film, you actually have the lead actor playing multiple generations of the same family at different ages and with different characterizations for each one, to the point where it actually takes you a second to realize it's the same actor, and it thus gives the sense that you are actually moving down the generational line, where you see the connections between father and son that aren't exactly apparent on first glance, but then you start noticing the physical similarities and the similar actions and reactions that have been passed down, and then of course it jumps forward across different generations. So it's not just father to son, sometimes it goes to a grandson, or it jumps ahead even further in time. The film is really dealing more with a particular theme than a beat-for-beat narrative. It's giving you different episodes in a single family's lineage that all depict the notion of Bushido, which is the idea of the code of honor which samurai conducted themselves with, and the loyalty they placed to their masters above all else. And this is actually a concept that, while there is some historical background, it was really something that was more invented in the years since by other writers, as gone into in some of the extras on this release as well. It's pointed out that the term Bushido really didn't even come to prominence until the late 1800s, when it was written about by someone looking back and trying to translate the concepts of Japanese myths and culture for a Western audience. So already you have the idea of certain things being turned into myth that didn't necessarily have true historical realism, or we're substituting myths for facts in order to tell a more appeasing story. This is really the core concept of the film and what it's playing around with, that a lot of times this notion of loyalty can blind people to what they're actually doing to themselves. And what happens in The Cruel Tale of Bushido is actually quite striking, because it trusts its audience enough to not exactly lay out what it's going to do. The opening actually takes place in the modern day and opens essentially with an episode of a man rushing to a hospital with obviously his loved one, who we have to infer has seemingly made a suicide attempt, and it's unknown whether she will live or not. And then the man has to reflect on how they got to this point and the guilt he's wrestling with, and it reminds him of the studies he's made into his family's past. And this essentially is the opening bookend sequence that gets us into the historical journey. And so we have this device established of seeing various historical records and documents that the man in the present day has actually studied, and he's thinking back about what he has learned and how he's starting to see all of these echoes of his past ancestors and the choices they made that he views as mistakes, how he has inadvertently repeated them, even though it's a completely different world in the modern day. The film's ultimate goal is to actually show that things aren't all that much different, really. So the film is actually divided into multiple sequences, and you have the bookend set in the modern day of 1963, and then each of the 6 main sequences that are telling about a past ancestor or family member, those start at a certain point in the days of the samurai and move all the way back up to where we pick up in the ending sequence with the resolution of the present day sequence. So the 1963 sequences are bookends to the 6 individual segments in the film. And so what you have is Kinnosuke Nakamura playing not 1, but 7 members of this family lineage, and it is an absolutely miraculous, astounding performance because each performance is completely unique and different, but you see the richly textured echoes of the other family members we've seen in the episodes before it. And it all ties into the film's central theme of how loyalty can blind one. And it harkens back to the famous iconic lines in The Wild Bunch about a man giving his word, and his word is so important that it can't be broken. And then the retort is, that's not what matters. What matters is who you give your word to. That sort of idea of misplaced loyalty being given to either figures of power or figures or individuals that are supposedly greater than oneself is not always being given to people who actually deserve it. And as is proven throughout this entire film, none of the powerful figures who are given blind obedience and absolute loyalty by members of this family ever once deserve it. The film has a very understated and really detached feeling. Its style has that observational quality, and I think that speaks to Imai's history in making social realism films, but it's also done to put the audience in the place or directly hearing the thoughts, as we hear in little bits of voiceover that connect the sequences, of the modern day character of Susumu reflecting on his family's past and all of the trials and tribulations and great pains that have plagued his family all these years. And so it also gives a sense of being a historical observer, because all of these sequences take place in the past, and we can see growth and development and connections between them in ways that obviously people of the time couldn't. But it starts to take on the feeling of being a historian reading a historical study of this family lineage. So that furthers the detached observational feeling, and again strengthens the connection between the audience and the lead Susumu character in the opening and closing. So by the time we get to the closing sequence, where we once again are in present day 1963, it doesn't feel weird or jarring. The whole film builds up to that final section. And even though it's not as big or as flashy as some of the sequences that preceded it, it is the heart and the core of the entire film, and everything you've seen leading up to that informs what you're actually supposed to be drawing from that end sequence. If you had the 2 modern day sequences just at the end of the other 6 episodes, and you didn't have the sensation of establishing why we're going on this journey, it wouldn't be as effective. The structure of the film is really key in putting the audience in at a certain point, and then really dragging the audience through the mud along with the characters because of this sense of absolute loyalty that ultimately destroys far more than it actually helps to create or build. And everyone in the family line and all of their loved ones are essentially collateral damage over the years. And there's also a level of suspense generated, because once you have the first sequence out of the way and you end in a dark yet poignant note, then you start the second sequence and you know that that same sort of ending is coming, and then the next sequence has it, and the next sequence has it, and the level of severity builds, and the level of collateral damage builds, and some of the sequences are longer and more detailed, which just makes the suspense ratchet up further because you as the audience feel the sense of dread, knowing what's going to most likely happen to these people, and you see them make the same mistakes that their ancestors did, except for some it results in far worse consequences, both physically to themselves or emotionally due to what happens to others, and again, the collateral damage. And it underlines how, in a great number of areas of human history, the core theme, if there was one, is unfortunately man's inhumanity to man. And when there are figures of power, they are most often, if not always, really more out for themselves, and those who pledge loyalty are simply treated as pawns on a chessboard, or further fuel for the fires of whatever their ambitions are. The common people and loyal subjects of this film in all of its episodes are essentially little more than pawns ready to be used and disposed of at the whims of whatever figure is in power, regardless of what the sequence is. These ideas and themes are probably at their strongest in the two primary episodes that are the longest and the most detailed. The first sees Nakamura playing a family member who is a young man, a scholar, who is essentially chosen by the lord, or the feudal lord, to serve as, another of his concubines. And this slowly starts to destroy and wear away at the young man's sense of self, and he feels demeaned. And you also, surprisingly for a film of this era, are dealing with homosexuality. And the lord also has female concubines as well, one of whom falls in love with the young man, and is a forbidden romance because they are both property of the lord. And the lord cannot understand why the young man doesn't appreciate his surroundings more. So there's a certain element of the perverse because the lord is toying with everyone around him, but you get the deep-rooted emotional destruction of essentially an innocent character. And you're also dealing with aspects that did actually happen in Japanese history that, typically are not things that are gone into all that much. And a Japanese film of this era actually dealing with homosexuality in any way was not just extremely uncommon, but really unheard of. In fact, in the supplements, one of the critics says that he thinks this is probably the first Japanese film to really deal with homosexuality in terms of the plot. So this episode is truly striking because it takes its time and it gets into the psychological makeup of all the characters and the sense of tragedy that controls all of their lives. And in odd ways, as you do in a lot of the episodes of this film, you actually get greater texture in terms of the villain of the piece. So even here, you have shades of gray and elements of the characterization of the Lord that you start to wonder, is he truly an outright villain? And of course, he does prove that he really is villainous in the act that is carried out, albeit off screen. The film does have consistent levels of characters being killed, or of course characters committing seppuku, which is ritual suicide. And this is always done in a very tasteful but hard-hitting way. All of the suffering that the characters go through is felt by the audience due to the weight of the drama. Very little of it is actually seen, and when you do see elements, especially in the suicides, they are the build-ups, and so you don't actually have to see the actual act being committed, because you've already gotten the buildup, and the film trusts the audience to know what is coming. And that just, again, adds to the sense of prevailing dread that builds in your stomach, along with the levels of suspense, because ultimately you know where all of this is going. You don't have to have a background in Japanese history to understand that things are not going to go well for any of these characters. So when the film actually does show moments of violence. They are, again, extraordinarily tasteful, but so hard-hitting because they are there to punctuate the drama and the depths of just how far the figures of power will go in grinding their subjects into the dirt, even if their subjects have devoted their entire lives to them and essentially sacrificed their families for them. And it really makes the violence all the more shocking because the violence is motivated by the drama and it is all one. And again, because the audience is a detached observer, that sense of dread and suspense boils over to the point where you will start feeling the urge to almost yell at the screen at the characters to encourage them to perhaps make a different decision and not go down this road, which is what the film wants you to do. The film wants the audience to get involved and to think about these concepts and themes and to understand how, in spite of everything you may have learned or what has happened in your family's past and knowing your family's history, these things run through all the way to our present day. And even though the film was made in 1963 and that's where the modern day bookends are, these are universal themes. They still apply just as much in 2026 as compared to 1963. The other major episode is really the other side of the coin, or the companion piece to the story of the promising young man whose life was destroyed by the Lord. Here, Nakamura plays a successful warrior who, after a display of his technique of blind swordsmanship, where he is blindfolded and able to carry out perfectly executed attacks, is brought into another lord's service, and over a long extended period of time, he has a lovely family and has absolute loyalty pledged to his lordship. But this is misplaced because over the course of a good number of years, we see the family torn apart. We see the daughter's happiness squashed, and she herself is given away as a trophy to a neighboring lord as a sort of political swap meet. She's essentially turned into a piece of property and sold off. Her beautiful mother is also destroyed due to the actions of the lord, and in spite of everything, after years of being the Lord's right hand and having to carry out whatever he is told to do and being rather emotionally shut off to anything other than the code of Bushido. And even after losing his entire family, it takes all of this and years of this building up within the warrior to finally have something snap. And you have this incredibly dramatic confrontation with the Lord where the warrior is still refusing to completely give up his own code of honor. He is, of course, performing everything with honor when everyone else in the sequence and those he pledges honor to, even to some degree at this point after having his entire life and family destroyed, he is doing this and staying to this code of conduct, even when he doesn't want to anymore. And he's doing this for people who don't deserve anything. And what in most films would turn into just a final one-man army bloodbath instead is all about the code of Bushido still having some sway and dominance. And this sequence is unbelievably dramatic and, again, pays off the sense of foreboding dread that the audience has, because it also does not end well. And so in spite of the audience thinking that perhaps for once the character who is leading this episode may have finally learned enough to stand on their own and not let the code of Bushido completely govern their existence, it's still there. It's so ingrained in them and they cannot overcome it. And then this continues through the other episodes that move closer and closer to the present day, whether it's a character who is too subservient to the ideals of the past and trying to assist a down on his luck former feudal lord attain some sense of prominence once again to rather disastrous results, or in the film's shortest but possibly most striking sequence, seeing one of the family members in World War II, and in what is, I think, the film's greatest example of trusting its audience. It never actually says what this person is doing or what these soldiers are doing, but you see a ritual performance where they are bowing to the figure in power, their commanding figure or officer, and they have this display of loyalty and respect. And the audience or the viewer can see what's going on. And if you have any knowledge of World War II, it becomes immediately apparent without any lines of dialogue or saying what's going on, exactly who these figures are and what they're preparing to do. And so this short sequence, which is the shortest of all of the episodes, with the least amount of dialogue, is one of the most effective in the entire film, because you realize that these figures aren't just soldiers, that they are in fact kamikaze pilots preparing for their final takeoff from which they will not return. So it is actually another form of ritualistic suicide. Finally, we come back to the present day in 1963 and pick up with the Susumu character. This is where we get the payoff of the opening. This is where we find out why the beautiful girl had attempted suicide. And what really hits home here is that, in spite of this being 1963 and it being two small figures within the emerging corporate world of inhumanity, it's exactly the same as everything we've seen in the past in the other episodes. There's no real difference between the feudal lords and their corporate bosses, except they're in suits and they're not openly killing people. They're just doing it by stripping away any sense of humanity or sense of self the people under them might have. Everything is sacrificed to a common goal. It's just now the almighty sense of profit for the corporate overlords. And this is where the film's social commentary is at its strongest, because you're allowed to draw these parallels yourself. It's not sitting there and hitting you over the head. And because you've had all of this pain and turmoil that you've gone through, and you've seen a family barely survive over the years, and seen generation after generation go through all of this intensive, terrible trouble, to get to this ending, you get to where you are just hoping and praying these characters will find some way out of this predicament, and that Susumu, in spite of understanding what his family has gone through, hoping that he will not just realize that he has repeated the same mistakes his ancestors made, but maybe he will be the first in the line to actually do something about it and to escape the fate that so obviously awaits him. So that is why the film is structured in the way that it is, and that's why it's so important to let it play out and to get on board with it. So by the time you get to the resolution of the modern day sequence, all of those themes come full circle, and the dramatic weight of the entire film hits you like a load of bricks. This is an incredible film because it is really unique. There's not really anything else I'm aware of that's quite like this. It's aided immeasurably by being in widescreen scope black and white, which alienates a lot of the characters and furthers the sense of dread, and is filled with remarkable framing throughout. This is a very wonderful film to look at in terms of that particular effect that only scope black and white films have. It was not a form that really lasted very long, as black and white was eventually seen as old-fashioned and every film had to be in color. But black and white scope films did technically last a bit longer in other countries, particularly Japan, and only black and white scope films have a particular effect of giving you more scope and spectacle, but in black and white, you still have the classical artistry and the sense of making images far more direct and nuanced than they ever are in color. So had this film been in color, I don't think it would have been as effective. And because it's in scope, you have the characters frequently broken up in the frame or composed to where they are alienated or dominated by their surroundings, which adds to the sense of oppression. So even visually, the film is complementing the events and staying out of the way. There's, again, the feeling of understatement and trusting one's audience even goes to how intelligently and well thought out the visuals are designed. But you also have to marvel at the astounding performances of Kinnosuke Nakamura, who again has to play all these different members of a family line across generations over hundreds of years and at different ages. With some of them, he has to play them at a large age range, which means, of course, facial hair and makeup towards the end to show the wear and tear of age. He also has to run the gamut of emotional expression depending on what these characters are going through, and never let on that these characters are going to meet predetermined ends. Each performance is completely unique and individual, to the point where at times, especially in the opening sequence, you don't necessarily realize it's the same actor from the opening modern day sequence. And it's a further testament to how incredible the performances are, that each one feels separate and unique from the others, and yet there are certain echoes of the story and the characterizations that tie them in as the same family line. And so it is appropriate to make the connection that it is like what Alec Guinness did in the masterpiece Kind Hearts and Coronets, but that was a particular style and more for comedic effect. Whereas here, you have an actor playing deeply textured characters that are extraordinarily three-dimensional in spite of only being in the individual segments of the film, and they actually start to add on one another, so it becomes a comprehensive performance. But I think it's one of the great performances I've ever seen. It is absolutely staggering, and if anything else, is the chief reason why people should seek out this film. But I think it's also a truly original, striking film that should be seen for its own merits and for daring to challenge the myths and legends of Japanese culture that had been readily accepted by this point, that may or may not have been fully rooted in actual fact. This is a really striking film that is made all the better for trusting its audience and being intelligent enough to present these events that are very unpleasant in areas and have a theme and a message, but to stay out of the way of the story it's telling and to trust the audience to be able to add two and two and to recognize these themes and understand where the story is going. It is an incredibly intelligent, motivated, strikingly original film that is truly deserving of the Masters of Cinema banner. Now to talk about the Eureka Masters of Cinema Blu-ray release. This is from a new 4K restoration by Toei of the film, and it has been released on Blu-ray only. This release is coded for regions A and B, so it's a release from Eureka that is available here in the US and the UK. So in terms of the 4K restoration master and the picture quality of the Eureka release, this is a very high-quality transfer of original elements and a beautiful black and white scope transfer. It's, of course, a new 4K restoration presented here in 1080p SDR on Blu-ray. Now, in terms of the overall image, I think the transfer is excellent and shows a nice grayscale of the black and white image, and is also mostly clear of damage throughout. There is just a fleeting little appearance here and there of a speck or two, or a tiny light scratch starting to poke in, and then of course one or two very small hairs in the gates that I think were just part of the original photography or elements. But it is very minor stuff that is to be expected in a film of this era, and it is much more preferable to have a well carried out, painstaking modern restoration that may have a few little inherent things like that, as opposed to a modern restoration attempt that is far too overzealous in its cleanup attempts and is unfortunately deleting or removing elements of the original production. There are a couple softer transition shots, which are of course just natural dupe transitions, which are to be expected of a film of this era, and in some of the panning shots, especially in the opening, you you will notice a little bit of scope lens distortion, and that's simply due to the anamorphic lenses they were using, which can always have a bit of distortion, the sort of stretching and unstretching distortion on pans and movement that you get with earlier anamorphic lenses as opposed to the later corrected Panavision ones. And a lot of foreign scope films of the era will have this stuff here and there. So when you see stuff like that, it's simply inherent to the anamorphic lenses being used. But that's really only confined to the opening. Again, the photography of this film is so well designed and so understated that at times there isn't a whole lot of camera movement. And so you just see a little fleeting glimpse of that here and there to know that they were obviously using some older anamorphic lenses. The only other thing I'll say about the visuals is that you will sometimes see just a little bit of fluctuation in the image in terms of the brightness fluctuating just a little bit here and there, almost like it's got just a little bit of a pulsating effect. I think that's just inherent to the original elements that they were using for this restoration. It is very minor, but especially when you're viewing this on an OLED television, you will notice it. But again, I think that's just inherent to the elements, and it's never truly distracting or anything, but it's just something to note. Another thing about watching this on an OLED in terms of the near black level chroma offshoot that can happen, especially with black and white films, due to the design of OLED televisions, you will get a bit of that here when watching this transfer. It's of course not part of this transfer or disc release at all. It's simply due to the nature of how OLEDs are designed. You will get some artifacting on the shadow detail and near black levels, and this is always more pronounced on black and white films. So just expect that to some degree if you're watching this on an OLED television, which, as far as I know, I don't think any OLED TV completely escapes that problem. It's just an inherent quirk of the panel technology, unfortunately. To talk about the disc encoding, this disc is frequently at a maxed out bit rate. It is averaging in the high 30s in terms of megabits per second and is almost always around 37 to 39 megabits per second. And this is a relatively longer feature, so that is quite impressive. And so it's at the same high quality standard that Eureka typically has on all their releases, so even the encoding is excellently done. In terms of the audio, we have two options, the Japanese mono track and then a Japanese 3.0 stereo track. The mono is presented in lossless PCM, and then the 3.0 is presented in lossless DTS HDMA. Now, it doesn't really say anything about these two audio options, and anytime you see a vintage film with listing 3.0, you might think, oh, well, perhaps that's a Perspecta stereo track, because a lot of Japanese films around this time actually use Perspecta stereo, and even some of Kurosawa's films use Perspecta on some of the engagements. But on video, even when they say something as a Perspecta stereo track, it isn't always one. Frequently, when you run into those, they are some sort of modern attempt to either recreate Perspecta stereo and not really doing the job, or just doing a modern upmix and acting like it's the original stereo, which it isn't. Now, for this film, I don't know if it actually had a Perspecta stereo mix originally. And for those who don't know, Perspecta stereo was often described as the poor man's magnetic stereo, because CinemaScope originally, as part of the format, when Fox brought it out with the Robe in 1953, had 4-track magnetic stereo as one of the big selling points, where you had left, center, right, and a mono surround, with magnetic audio actually printed onto the film, which was much higher quality than standard optical tracks. The problem was most theater exhibitors didn't want to go to the added expense of buying new sound equipment and putting in new speakers, because they'd already put all their money into converting to widescreen. And so unfortunately that kind of fell by the wayside, and we had to wait until Dolby Stereo for anything besides optical mono to achieve prominence. Well, a lot of this actually filtered into foreign releases and what other studios were doing in other countries. So you saw some films get other sound formats here and there, but not a lot of these survive. Anyhow, what Perspecta Stereo actually was a rather ingenious system of steering around multi-channel elements within a mono mix or an expanded mono mix. In the really good Perspecta mixes that have great preservations we have access to, it's an astoundingly striking experience for what is essentially a very limited nature system that is not fully discrete in terms of having discrete channels. So if you want to really experience Perspecta stereo, I would suggest picking up the Blu-rays of the science fiction classic masterwork It Came From Outer Space, or the science fiction classic This Island Earth, both with amazing Perspecta stereo restorations. Now, here on this release, the 3.0 track is unfortunately not that. First, I would like to talk about the mono mix. I think the mono mix sounds really lovely. It's very clear. There's a lot of high-end detail. There is natural hiss. There doesn't seem to be any sort of heavy-handed audio processing that's been applied. And it sounds consistently good throughout and appropriate for a 1963 Japanese film that's a mono mix. This 3.0 track, however, instead of being a sort of alternate stereo mix with greater fidelity, when you sample the two and compare them, it just sounds like the mono mix that has been upmixed to a surround codec. But instead of going for the full 5.1, they just went for 3.0. So you have left, center, right. And what you'll hear is essentially the dialogue, and most of the mono mix has now been put into the center channel. And then there's some ambiance and dialogue and the music that is sort of expanded into your left and right channels. It doesn't sound like a fully discrete mix. And when you're listening to this, it frequently feels like expanded mono. And it also sounds a little bit muffled compared to the actual mono mix itself on the disc. You also lose a little bit of the high-end detail, and thus you lose a little bit of clarity, and that's why it sounds a bit muffled. So I did a lot of back and forth comparing of these two tracks, and my conclusion is that the 3.0 just sounds like an upmix attempt of the mono and not some sort of vintage alternate stereo track that was at least Perspecta or some other system that was actually discrete. So I would say that it's best to just view the film with the mono mix, as it does sound better, it sounds clearer, it's more direct, it has more high-end detail. And the mono presentation is quite full-bodied, and especially if you have really good main left and right speakers, you won't even notice that it's mono. It's a good mix that's very full-bodied, and it sounds better than the 3.0 track. So I would encourage people who pick up this release to compare the audio tracks for yourself and see what you think. You may wind up preferring the 3.0 track if that just suits your home theater environment better, but I do think it's just an upmix attempt of the mono track. I don't think it's a vintage discrete mix or Perspecta mix, and I do think it's actually inferior to the mono track. Of course, this is a Japanese film, and there are English subtitles that are automatically applied when you're watching the Blu-ray. They are extremely well done. I didn't notice any issues whatsoever in the subtitles, and I thought the subtitles were overall excellent throughout the whole film, so no issues there, although they do actually give you subtitles for a few signs here and there in terms of a location or an army camp, and you see a flag with a sign on it. So they are English subtitles that will also occasionally translate signs and locations that are listed in Japanese, which is helpful for us who don't speak Japanese, but I know that does annoy some people in terms of there are some who prefer subtitles to only be translating the dialogue. Now we turn to packaging and artwork, and the limited edition comes with this slipcover with the absolutely gorgeous artwork by the incomparable Tony Stella, who once again just nails the level of detail and depicting the characters. And as you can clearly see, he's made sure to actually have as many of the renderings of the different characters in the family line as possible, and given it this great mixture of sort of gray-blue and blood red or flame orange, and then culminating in the famous image used on a lot of the posters where the warrior actually has his sword impaled through his hand and pinning it to the wood beneath. This is an absolutely stunning cover, and I think even among Tony Stella's great art, I think it's one of his best. And I think this makes for a great new definitive poster as a single representative image for the whole film, because this image does tell you everything you need to know about this film. It conveys all of the pain and strife the characters go through, and the traveling through the family line, and it's just absolutely stunning. So outstanding work once again. We then have the Masters of Cinema spine with the lovely title font on the side, and then the rear and the usual Masters of Cinema style with nice images, which are also nicely in scope, and then the list of supplements. And again, this is a region A and B release, so you can get this in the US and the UK. Inside we have the case with the MOC banner across the top, spine 345, and we are treated to the image of the warrior with his impaled hand. And just the look on Nakamura's face, it just speaks volumes. So this is a perfect choice for the internal case art and lets you know exactly what sort of film you're in for. The rear gives you the same information as the slipcover, just reconfigured for the standard case listing. Inside, we have a great image for the disc label. And then for the internal image, we have a wonderful wraparound image of one of the other ancestors in his sort of last stand moment. We, of course, have a lovely booklet in the MOC style, this with the striking poster artwork as the front cover. This is credited as artwork from the Hungarian poster, and I think this looks so striking that they could have even used it as the cover for this release. We have the usual excellent MOC booklet style with great images, wonderful reproduction, done on nice glossy paper. And then we have the essay by Haley Scanlon, which is absolutely excellent and gives you even more context about the history of this film, and especially the history of the concept of Bushido and where it was actually originally developed. We have more wonderful images and very nicely printed text that is also easily readable, which is key in any booklet. This runs about 20 pages and has the usual Eureka credits at the back, and also the viewing notes, which thankfully always mention that people should ensure their TVs have any motion smoothing turned off. Now to talk about the supplemental features that are on the disc, we have 3 of them. The first of them is an interview with Tony Raines, which runs just over 20 minutes. It's actually about 21 and a half minutes. This is another of his wonderful on-camera discussions, which he does for a lot of Eureka releases, so anytime you see his name on a release, you know that it's going to be time well spent. He goes over the production of the film, it being made by the Toei studio, where the director and writer's careers had come from and what this film meant for their careers, also discussing the lead actor in multiple roles and the connection with Kind Hearts and Coronets, and also this is where he discusses the whole notion of homosexuality being used as a plot point, being at this point probably completely unique in Japanese cinema. So this is really a wonderful overall discussion about the effect of the entire film, its historical context, and the point in which it was made, and also what everybody making it was sort of feeling and reacting to. So this is a wonderful supplement and the best of the on-disc ones because it's the most comprehensive. Another nice bonus is that not only is this well encoded and nicely edited, but the audio is also lossless PCM as well, which typically doesn't happen on a lot of extras. The second disc extra is called 7 Kinds of Samurai. This is a video essay by Jonathan Clements. It runs just over 16 minutes. This is cut to clips of the film, and it's basically talking about the historical context of some of the figures and the various lords and killings that happen, and how they are either directly referencing historical events or they were inspired by historical events. So this is basically giving you some of the actual historical context for things you see in the film and how the episodes tie together. And then we have the film's original trailer, which is in HD. It also seems to be the product of this new restoration, and it also has lossless PCM mono audio. It nicely has English subtitles for all the dialogue and narration. There's a little bit of exclusive narration just for this trailer to set up the various clips, and I think they did use a lot of the restoration master to actually rebuild this trailer, which was quite nice of them. But it does have some unique shots and text and things, so it is still the original trailer, and you will see some slight damage and wear in some of those, but it is a really nicely done restoration trailer that also nicely gives us the English subtitles, and it is also in the original scope aspect ratio. So that is the Eureka Masters of Cinema Blu-ray release of The Cruel Tale of Bushido, which is a very bold and striking original film that stays with you long after you've watched it. And I think it was very deserving of winning the Golden Bear at that year's Berlin International Film Festival. That's the major award that it won, and I think it was very deserved because this is just such a completely original film that is so deeply textured and, on one hand, rooted in Japanese history and culture, but is also not being blinded by the legends and myths that surround and permeate Japanese culture. It's trying to be as detached and observational as possible and tell its point without ever hitting the audience over the head or shoehorning things in. And that makes it all the more effective. It is, I think, essential viewing for anyone who loves samurai films or anyone who has ever enjoyed even just the famous works of Kurosawa. If you're at all into Japanese cinema, I think this is an absolute must, but particularly you have to see this film for the just staggering performances, because you're going to have to keep in mind it's multiple performances, not just a single performance, of Kinnosuke Nakamura, who is just sensational in this film time and time and time and time again, because he is playing, essentially 7 different characters who all build upon and inform upon the other. So it is just a massive, complete, total performance that dominates the film, because it is the through line and heart of the entire film. This has been given a lovely new 4K restoration, and Eureka has once again produced a beautiful Blu-ray where every aspect has been done as good as humanly possible, and it's another essential title in the Masters of Cinema line. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films, world cinema, and physical media has been at least somewhat fun and informative. This is a title that I hadn't seen before, but I had heard something of, and I was really blown away at how original and striking it was. But I don't think anything can quite prepare you for the levels of detail and the impact that you get from Nakamura's performances across the entirety of this film. And it's a film that is full of surprises. It truly is. And it also defies genre classification. It is not merely just a samurai film. It transcends that. It transcends genre classification. So I would encourage anyone who has watched this video who is even remotely interested in any of the aspects I've discussed to give this a chance. It's a beautifully produced Eureka release with some lovely supplements that'll give you even more context, and it also has beautiful Tony Stella artwork, and it is relatively inexpensive. Plus, it's also one of the Eureka MOC titles that they have been able to release in both markets, so you can easily get it here in the US, unlike the MOC titles that you still have to import because they are UK Region B exclusive. So please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc in order to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.